Right. So I'm going to speak with you briefly this morning about the idea of collaboration in context, one of the themes of our day today. And as Jeff mentioned, I'm from Western Australia, really Western Australia. In fact, I had trouble getting Adelaide and Colorado on the same picture of the globe. They're just at opposite ends. By the time I get back to Colorado tomorrow, I will have traveled the equivalent of 2/3 of the circumference of the earth. But I'm really excited. I'm really thankful, grateful to be here with you today to think about these challenging issues around how we really actually move the needle on key indicators of wicked problems, how we promote the well-being of children and young people, how we strengthen families, how we strengthen communities. And as Jeff mentioned, in particular, I want to think about that in the context of Communities for Children, the tremendous national resource that's represented by the infrastructure, the national infrastructure that's been funded for years and years and years through Communities for Children. Because I got involved in this work when, as Jeff mentioned, Ross Hummel from Griffith University in Queensland had seen a report that came out in 2014 that essentially found that, after years of this valiant effort, that Communities for Children wasn't really making the kind of impact that we hoped it would make. And so Ross Hummel had been familiar with some work that I had been involved with in the United States, where we had been successful in taking a collective impact initiative, scaling it up in many, many communities across the whole state. And we were able to actually significantly move the needle on key indicators of child well-being, measured at a population level, measured across whole communities of children, regardless of whether they had been through a specific targeted individual intervention. We were able to shift the needle on community-level population health, public health. And so Ross came over to visit us in the U.S. He told us about what was going on in Australia, and that began a long relationship between me and this research team at Griffith University, where we've just been continually thinking about, well, what makes collective impact work? What are the essential components of an effective collective impact strategy? And how can we, rather than, as Jeff said this morning, throwing out the baby with the bathwater, how can we take the significant infrastructure that's represented by Communities for Children across Australia and embed good science, good prevention science, good implementation science into that existing infrastructure and strengthen the way we actually do Communities for Children? Strengthen the way Communities for Children as an idea, as a concept, is actually practiced and implemented in the real world. So that's what we've been working on. Now, on one hand, hearing that, that the years of effort in Communities for Children hasn't been all that effective in moving the needle on key indicators, that can take the wind out of your sails. That can be kind of a punch in the gut. But I want to tell you that there's a very rational reason why that would be the case. We are currently in a significant, important period of enlightenment in this space, in this sector. We have only recently entered a period of enlightenment where the last 30 years has generated an explosion of prevention science and new knowledge about the precursors, about the causal risk and protective factors that put children on trajectories toward poor outcomes. And that new body of knowledge has really upset our centuries of thinking about how these problems happen and what would be the way to address these wicked problems. So we've just been exposed to new technology in the form of this new knowledge base. We have new ways to think about. Think about concepts like the social determinants of health, which I would rather call the social influencers of health. I'm not deterministic. But think about the complexity of the social determinants of health. Think about ideas like adverse childhood experiences, childhood trauma that has lasting lifetime physiological impact on individual children. These are new ideas that really help us better understand the complexity of the drivers of the wicked problems that we're trying to prevent and reduce, right? So faced with that new knowledge, it's time for us to step back a little bit and think about how we now need to reinvent our entire network of systems and structures and resources. We have to think about what new capacities, this new knowledge, this new innovation in our understanding, what new capacities does it mandate that we now build in to public systems and communities to create enabling contexts for us to unleash the potential of this new knowledge base, right? So that's what I'm going to challenge us to think about this morning. I mean, we're in a period right now where we need to invest. We need to make a new investment, or we need to shift our current investment into the capacity building to surround our new innovation before we can take it to scale and expect to achieve positive impact. I'll give you an example. How many people have a smartphone on them right now? Right, almost everyone. So I don't know how my age compares to the median age of the delegates in the room, but I remember working at a job that didn't have a computer on the desk. I remember working at a job before there was email. And I remember getting from point A to point B with a folded map that I could never refold, right? So how many people in the last week have used their telephone, their smartphone, the map function on it to get from one place to another? Raise your hand if you've done that. Okay. How many people in the last week have, or last month, let's say, have used a paper folded map to get from one point to another? Okay, so there are. I want you to look around. See, there are a few. People are still using folded maps when the technology to have every map in the world in your pocket. Think about if we converted all the maps that we can access on our phones into paper maps and filled a room with those maps. Think of the amount of space that would take. So the technology that we have to have every map in the world in our pocket, at our disposal, that technology has been around for quite a while now, actually, over a decade. And yet we still have some people that are using for a variety of reasons. Maybe they choose to, maybe they didn't have cell service where they were going, whatever. But we're still in that transition period. We still haven't emerged from the old way of doing things to the new way of doing things completely. And that's where we are in prevention science. That's where we are in community collective impact. That's where we are in place-based initiatives and promoting better outcomes for children and young people. So the question is, how do we get our knowledge about what works to transform the field so significantly that effective strategies become the norm rather than the exception? And how do we do this in a way that's pragmatic, practical, rather than dogmatic? I will tell you, we are taking a very dogmatic approach to our newly evolved knowledge base, and certainly to our newly evolved evidence base. As John said this morning, the pendulum has swung too far in the other direction, and we need to find a rational middle ground that makes sense. Now, I love this idea of silos to symphonies. So this is my second week of speaking to different communities for children groups. This is my 6th presentation in 2 weeks. I started last week in Launceston in Tasmania, speaking to Tasmania C4C groups. And one of the first things I saw when I landed in Launceston, how many people have been to Launceston in Tasmania? Have you seen the Peppers Silo Hotel? So this was literally, I mean, how fortuitous. This was literally one of the first things I saw when I landed in Launceston. The Peppers Silo Hotel is, it's a set of silos that were built a long time ago and fit for purpose when they were built. They were built on the banks of the river where there was lots of transport of cargo, and those silos were used to store grains to load onto ships in the river. Over time, and they were built, they were fit for purpose at the time they were built, based on what was going on, based on the local context of what was happening at that time. 2018, they no longer serve that function, but they represent a potentially valuable infrastructure. And rather than just tear them down, someone reimagined what we could do with this existing infrastructure. And they turned it into an upscale hotel. And I love the fact that this is multiple silos that all collectively form this place to live, this community for travelers. It's a great metaphor for me. So there are lots of pieces to this puzzle of the work that we're doing. And I think one of the most important things that we can do to go forward is to step back. Step back and look critically. Unpack all of these overused trite terms that have come to mean everything, and so they mean nothing. But let's think about what the different pieces, what the different important key pieces of this puzzle are. So we've got collective impact. Let's unpack that and think about what does that really mean? Is it really better to work together? Or is the whole really better than the sum of its parts? Or does it just make us go to lots more meetings and work more inefficiently? Let's think about that. Let's think about how could we practice collective impact in a specific way, guided by science, guided by this new knowledge base to help it mean something rather than just words. Let's think about community voice and engagement. Again, something that we pander to all the time. We say this is a community engaged initiative. We say it's communities for children. But how often are the communities and the children actually at the table? What are we doing to build the capacities of the children and families who live in the communities we're trying to work with, work for? How often are we really, truly, authentically engaging them in this process? It's tough, it's challenging. That's the scary part. Place-based strategies. What does that mean and why does it matter? Place-based strategies. That could mean something, it could mean nothing, it could mean everything. I showed you that picture of myself in Colorado on my horse with the buffalo and whatnot. But I spent most of my professional career working in America's most violent cities as a youth gang specialist for the United States Department of Justice. And so that was the context that I worked in with young people, and that was the lens that I viewed the problems through. And now I live nearly 30 kilometers from the nearest traffic signal. So context matters, but no matter where I have been, whether it's the most violent urban cities in America or out in the middle of nowhere in a very rural agricultural part of Colorado, I can tell you that in every community in America and every community across the world, parents, communities are concerned about the same things. They're concerned about youth violence. They're concerned about drug use. They're concerned about the mental well-being of children and families. They're concerned about drug use. They're concerned about bullying and truancy and school leaving. They're concerned about smoking and drinking and cannabis use and harder drugs. Every community is concerned with trying to achieve better outcomes for children and families. And every community has some amount of these behavioral outcome problems. But I will put to you that what drives those problems is very different from one community to the next. What drives those problems is very different from one community to the next. So we can't sit in the capital, in the state capital or the country's capital, and come up with some one-size-fits-all solution and push it out to such a diversity of communities. One of the biggest challenges to effective policy making is coming up with a policy that is equally beneficial to a wide variety of very different communities. So I'm going to talk to you about, instead of a solution that is a program, a solution that's a process, a solution that is about skilling up the capacities of local communities to use the latest science and research and use good data to inform them about what the problems are in their community, what is driving those problems in their community, and what would be the best fit solutions for their community. And that's going to involve evidence-based programs. That's going to involve data-informed decision-making. So my message quickly today is the most wicked problems that interfere with positive human development are in fact preventable. We have to start from that place. We have to start by acknowledging that in the last 30 years, we've amassed a huge number of programs and strategies that have been tested in randomized controlled trials, the most rigorous form of scientific evaluation, and proven that they can significantly prevent and reduce our most wicked problems. So we have to start with that acknowledgement. Currently, though, our public systems and community capacities don't represent enabling context for our knowledge about what works, to actually make use of all of that knowledge. And so, finally, a greater investment in prevention coupled with a greater investment in capacity-building infrastructure can maximize the future potential of Australia's population health, its workforce, and its economy. We can do this. This is something that we can do. We can do it because I've seen it done. So we have to start from the place that every child is born on a life path full of possibilities. And I know, I'm preaching to the choir here. I know you know this, but we need to constantly remind ourselves about children being on developmental trajectories. And when children are born, if you think about all the children that are born in Adelaide in a given year, put them all in a room and not know anything about their families or where they're from or their socioeconomic status, you can't tell those children apart. You could look at that room full of children and say, all of these children can grow up to do something fantastic. Children are born on a life path full of possibilities, but very quickly their life course trajectories diverge. And there are very important things that happen at very important developmental milestone periods. So that gives us specific places that we can think about to intervene. And we also know that the negative effects of these different things that happen, good and bad, that impact children's trajectories, good and bad, that they're cascading, they're cumulative, they pile up on one another. So the earlier we start, the less history we'll have to unpack to change a child's trajectory, right? So as I mentioned that we need to start from the place that prevention works. All of these wicked problems have been prevented in randomized controlled trials. We have evidence-based approaches for every one of these wicked problems that vex us. And I think the important thing to take away from that is that prevention, changing children's life course trajectories, is not something that we just passionately, philosophically believe in. It's science. It's empirically proven. And there's an important difference between those things. We're no longer working on faith. We're working on science. And once we empirically prove that we can prevent these wicked problems, we have a moral and ethical responsibility to do that. We can't just say, well, bad things happen all the time. Let's just sit around and wait for the children to sort themselves into our system silos, and then we'll try to clean up the mess. We have a moral and ethical responsibility to take what has been proven to work and do as much of it as humanly possible, to narrow the funnel, to reduce the numbers of children that flow into our systems. There's a gentleman in the United States who's become very well known. Brian Samuels he originally was head of the children's child welfare system in Chicago in the United States, and he did great work there. A very troubled, very overwhelmed child welfare system in a big high-risk city. He did well in that system, and under the Obama administration, Barack Obama pulled him into the federal government, and then he went on to lead the Federal Children's Bureau. And he very famously said at one point, as he was leading the child welfare system in Chicago, he stepped forward and he said, I have to admit that our system is broken. Children do not come out of the child welfare system in Illinois better than when they went in. Our public systems are by the legacy of when they were created and what the ideas were behind children's well-being at that time, at the time that those systems were first created. As a legacy of that history, he said, our public systems are racist and oppressive. Our public systems are racist and oppressive, and they're broken, and they don't make children better. And so he said, we have a moral imperative to prevent as many children as humanly possible from going into these broken systems until we can fix these systems. So this idea of prevention science that I keep rattling on about. So the foundation for prevention science is in the public health approach. So, and again, I apologize if I'm telling you things you already know, but at the very least, I'll give you new language to share this information with other people. So the public health approach says, if we're struggling with something that's at an epidemic proportion, like child abuse and neglect, or heart disease, or lung cancer, if we're struggling with a public health epidemic, we first start by doing epidemiological research. We study the population that has that problem, and we look for things that they have in common. We look for characteristics that population shares. And then we look for characteristics that population shares that the rest of the population that doesn't have that problem don't seem to share. And those become our known risk factors, right? Those are identified as things that statistically predispose us to some poor outcome. So if you smoke, what does that statistically predispose you to? Yell them out. Emphysema. What else? Smoking. Why don't we smoke? Why do we encourage populations not to smoke? I'm between you and lunch. Yell them out. Heart disease, lung cancer, emphysema. There's a whole host. We know factually that there's a whole host of poor health outcomes that you are at greater risk for if you regularly smoke. And that's why smoking rates have gone way, way down. We studied that. We identified smoking as a risk factor not for one thing, but for a whole host of poor outcomes. We educated the public about that, and now the public is engaged in reducing and preventing those many poor health outcomes, and the rates have gone way down. We can say the same thing about heart disease, right? We know that if you smoke, you're at higher rate for cardiovascular disease. We know also, though, that if you have a poor diet, if you have a sedentary lifestyle and you don't exercise, if you have genetic predisposition in your family, all of those things individually and collectively put us at statistically greater risk for cardiovascular disease. So those are risk factors. So we've taken that same thinking and applied it to things like youth crime, youth drug use, child well-being, school failure and leaving, teen pregnancy. We've studied the populations of young people who have these issues, and we've identified characteristics that they share in common. And those have become the known list of risk factors that we're trying to target in this work. So we can take that same idea and apply it to what communities do in the name of collective impact and prevention, community-focused, place-based prevention. We bring the stakeholders together, bring all the stakeholders together in a community. We create a community diagnostic risk profile that's specific to that given community that says, here are all the known risk and protective factors that are associated with these wicked problems we're trying to prevent and reduce. Here's how much of those risk and protective factors exist in this particular community. So now we have a community-specific diagnostic profile. Then we use that diagnostic profile to select priorities and strategies that match that profile. And then we implement them, and then we evaluate them. This sounds like complete common sense, right? This sounds so obvious. Does it reflect business as usual? Ask yourselves that. I can go into any community and say, make me a list of all the programs and services you currently have in place that are being offered to children and families in the name of improving their outcomes. For each one of these, tell me how it ended up here in the community. Did it end up here in the community through this kind of data-informed diagnostic strategic prevention planning process? I argue in most cases, no. Some have. Some programs that are currently being delivered in communities were carefully selected based on a community's specific diagnostic risk profile. In most cases, not. So why are they there? How do we know that this is the right medicine for the right illness? So we did this in Pennsylvania. We applied this approach in 128 communities across the state of Pennsylvania. We created these collective impact coalitions. We used a model that followed that process that I just described. In every community, we helped them gather data. Youth self-report data. Youth self-report, again, think about what John Lynch said this morning about the importance of not relying solely on systems data. Because systems tell stories about how systems are responding to problems. That may or may not be a story about the lived experience of those people. If you want the story of the lived experience of people, if you really want to know what the risk and protective factors are in a given community, you go to the people themselves. You ask them to tell you, to self-report on their lived experience. So we primarily use a youth self-report survey that collects data on these known risk and protective factors. And then for each community, we generate a data profile that is the catalyst for a community-led discussion. It's maybe facilitated by professionals who are skilled in collective impact and community organization, community mobilizing, but it's a locally driven conversation about what does this data from our children that our children have just given to us, what does this data mean to us, and what will it say about what our collective impact priorities are? The collective impact priorities, so in this case, this community has used this data. They've acknowledged that the risk happens in different ecological domains, so we encourage them to pick a priority from across multiple domains of the ecology. We don't want to just be working in the schools. We don't want to just be working with the families. We don't want to just be working with communities. We want to make sure we're hitting all of those spaces, so across the ecology and across important developmental milestones. So there are specific developmental high-risk periods where we want to make sure that we've got something in place in all of those important high-risk periods. So this community said, okay, well, based on this, if this is our data, we're going to focus on low neighborhood attachment, parental attitudes towards alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs, academic difficulty, and low school commitment. Now they've narrowed down their long list of all the possible things that science says might be driving the problem in their community, and now they've identified 4 very specific things that the data from young people says are most likely driving the problems for most of the kids in that community. Does that make sense so far? Now, the importance of this, there are several important aspects of communities getting to this place. One is they've gone from trying to address everything, which will never have enough time or energy or resources to do, narrowed it down to 4 very specific things. These 4 very specific things are risk factors for multiple behavioral outcomes. So they're of interest to multiple siloed systems. Does that make sense? Just like tackling smoking instead of tackling cardiovascular disease. You tackle cardiovascular disease or you tackle lung cancer by tackling smoking, the underlying risk factor. And at the same time, you might tick multiple boxes, right? Now, I want to stress that these 4 things that the collective impact group has determined are their priorities. That does not mean that everybody that's part of the collective impact group, that all the NGOs and service providers are being asked to abandon their own priorities, to stop doing whatever they've been doing, and now take a hard pivot and only do these things. These 4 priorities don't become everything the community does. They become the very small number of things that the community gangs up on. These are the 4 things we're all going to do together. Everybody else still gets to maintain their territory. Everybody gets to continue doing what they've been doing. Now, so an individual agency or service provider that's part of this collective impact coalition can say, okay, what have we always been doing? What's our current array of programs and services that we're currently delivering? We never had this data before, so we never knew that these were important priorities for our community. Is there any way we can take any of the programs and services that we're already delivering and maybe tailor them a little bit to be more specifically directed to one or more of these risk factors? This is the collective impact part of collective impact, right? I use the metaphor of a magnifying glass. Now I'm gonna date myself again. Do people remember playing with magnifying glasses and shining the sun through magnifying glasses and trying to set grass on fire? Remember that? Right? So when you do that, when you can start a fire on the grass with a magnifying glass, you're not adding any resource material to that. You're taking the same number of individual rays of sunshine that were already falling on the grass and not starting a fire because they were all spread out and diluted. Now with the magnifying glass, with the collective impact glass, with this lens that's informed by data, you take that same number of resources and you focus a portion of them very narrowly on a narrowly defined target. And now you can start a fire. And now you can move the needle on these wicked problems by addressing their underlying risk factors. Does that make sense? So we did this, like I said, we did this in these 128 communities throughout the state, guided them through this process, and as a result, we went from this being our footprint of evidence-based strategies that were being implemented when we started to this. We literally saturated the state with evidence-based programs, but we saturated the state with evidence-based programs that were carefully selected by communities because they met a need, a very specific need that the community had identified using local data. And that's different than we saturated the state with evidence-based programs because we mandated that they spend 30% of their money on things that are on a list. Right? That's different. So we have, part of the reason I think policymakers want to mandate a minimum percentage of things that be spent on evidence-based programs is because they understand that evidence-based programs can be valuable, but if communities don't have the infrastructure and the capacity to do this good local diagnostic needs assessment, What other option is there? How could communities pick something off the list? Well, it's on the list. We'll get money for it. Let's pick it. Right? Then it makes no sense. That's dogmatic approach to evidence-based strategy. Now, when we measured whether any of this was making a difference across these 128 communities, so I mentioned that the communities create this diagnostic risk profile based on a youth self-report survey. The good news for us, from a research standpoint, was that this youth self-report risk assessment survey that these kids completed in these 128 communities was actually implemented in all the schools in the state. So every community was collecting this same data, but only these 128 communities were using the data to do data-informed strategic prevention planning and a collective impact framework. That meant that we had 380 other schools, communities, that had similar data but weren't doing anything with it. That created a great natural experiment, what John Lynch referred to this morning as a quasi-experimental design. We've got a comparison group here. And so when we followed the kids that lived in these 128 communities and we compared their risk and protective factor data and their prevalence rates of problem behaviors over a 5-year period and compared it to all the kids in the other communities that weren't using the data in this way to do data-informed strategic prevention planning in a collective impact framework, we found that these kids in these collective impact communities had significantly lower rates, both practically significant and statistically significant difference in terms of lower rates of delinquency. And I forgot to mention, this whole initiative was rolled out as a youth crime prevention initiative. This was rolled out across the state to try to address the narrowly defined problem of youth crime, juvenile delinquency, kids ending up in the youth court system, right? So we ticked that box. We did that thing. It met its primary goal. But when we were doing this, we never talked about youth crime. We talked about risk and protective factors. Because guess what? The same things that put children at risk for youth crime and delinquency put kids at risk for school leaving and for youth drug use and for teen pregnancy and for depression and anxiety. It's a shared, common, universal group of risk and protective factors, right? So instead of going into this saying, we want to reduce youth crime, let's focus on youth crime, let's focus on when youth crime is happening and be narrow in our focus. Instead, we said, let's look upstream at where this youth crime might be coming from and address those underlying causative mechanisms. So we ticked that box on youth crime, but guess what? We also found that these kids said they were much less influenced by negative peer groups. In fact, we did, interestingly, we did a social network analysis. This was kind of a side project. We did a social network analysis. And I don't know if you've seen social network maps. Basically, we asked kids to tell us who influences them in their peer group among their school grade or classroom. And they identified the initials of the kids' names or whatever. And we can create a map, a pictorial map of the network of peer influence. And what we found was at the beginning of this, at the center of the network of peer influence were kids who were mostly antisocial. They had antisocial ideas and attitudes and intentions. And later on, when we remapped these social networks, we found that the networks had actually changed. The peer group networks had changed to where the antisocial kids were now out on the fringes of the peer networks. They were no longer the primary influencers of the peer group, and the kids that had moved to the center of the peer social networks were actually pro-social, more pro-social. So that might be part of what's explaining this reduction in negative peer influence. These kids in these collective impact communities told us that they were much more engaged in school. They had statistically and significantly higher levels of school engagement. They were finding schools a more enjoyable place to be. They were recognizing the value of being in school. And they achieved 33%, now 33% comparative across a 33 comparative difference between the two groups. 33% better academic performance. 33% better school grades. 33% better school grades. This is a youth crime prevention initiative. What business does it have impacting school engagement and school grades? Tell me. Who knows? Why would a youth crime prevention initiative impact school engagement and school performance? Yes, because we're focusing on risk and protective factors. And the same risk and protective factors that predispose kids to youth crime predispose kids and more kids, and probably sooner, for school engagement and academic achievement. Right? Makes sense. Now the school, when we started this collective impact initiative, it was kind of tough to get the schools engaged in this process because they had heard that it was a youth crime prevention initiative. And they're like, well, that's not our business. That's not our silo. That's somebody else's silo. When this data came out, now all of a sudden the schools are encouraging other schools in other communities to get engaged in this process because they can say, now this matters to our silo too. So this is a boundary spanning approach. This is a silo spanning approach because the underlying risk and protective factors, they're not slaves to anybody's silo, right? So again, this is a collective impact process through risk-focused, place-based, because it's specific to place. Each community has their own profile. Each community makes their own decisions about what that profile means in terms of what's driving the problems, what problems they care about, what their priorities are. The community selects the priorities, and then they choose programs and strategies that they think meet those priorities. So this is, I don't have time to get into this, unfortunately. I just wanted to put this up here because as part of the International Union of Public Speakers, I'm required, as John Lynch was, to show you a slide you can't read. So, box tick. This is a list of of some of these risk and protective factors divided into different domains. I wanted just to point out that any given risk factor actually predisposes kids to multiple poor outcomes. I talked about that. And likewise, any outcome, like teen pregnancy, is predicted by multiple risk factors across different ecological domains. That's the way we have to work. That's the new knowledge that reflects current prevention science. And that's the way we need to operate. And it's not reflected in the way our systems and capacities are currently structured. Shared predictors across outcomes and systems are siloed into systems. They're siloed into these narrowly defined systems, but that's not the way it happens. So collectively, these kind of community profiles can promote coordination and collective impact and inform state-level priorities. So imagine now you work for Pennsylvania's equivalent of DSS. Now you've got 128 individual communities who did this very localized needs assessment. All 128 of these communities came up with a list of 3 to 5 of their locally chosen, community-chosen priorities. Well, guess what? Across all those 128, maybe there were 5 that kept coming up over and over and over again. So if you're with DSS and 128 communities do this individualized priority setting and 5 priorities come up over and over again, well, they just did your needs assessment. Because now those are obviously state priorities. They're not community specific. They're something that's a need that is coming up in place after place after place. So now the state agencies can say, well, maybe we can take a larger role in addressing that problem at scale. Maybe we can find a program that addresses that risk factor that communities keep prioritizing on their own. But we can find a program or a few programs that target that specific priority, and we, at the state government level, we can scale up the capacity across the state to allow communities to do that program. Make trainers available, make trained practitioners available. If there are curriculum materials involved, make the curriculum materials available that we buy at an economy of scale. Does that make sense? So these things feed into each other. It's still local decision making. It's still place-based, but it feeds into priority setting across the whole state. So, this leads us to this issue of evidence-based. I talked about one of the aspects that resulted in these good outcomes that we found in Pennsylvania was that in a lot of cases, not in every case, communities were picking their own priorities and they were deciding for themselves what would work best to fit those priorities that they had selected. And sometimes they selected evidence-based programs. Sometimes they said, yes, there is something with strong evidence of effectiveness out there that meets the need that we've just prioritized. So we'll go with that. We'll go with that thing because it's already got a strong evidence base. And so we've really jumped into this whole evidence-based thing in the United States. So much so now that we have multiple national registries of evidence-based programs that people can go on to and enter some search terms and find something that has strong evidence of effectiveness. We have a number of them. I would recommend to you to check out a registry called Blueprints for Healthy Youth Development. I'm in this business, and I can tell you that of all of the registries that exist out there, this one has the most rigorous standard, and it's updated regularly. It has an international board of scientists that are constantly reviewing the research to determine what merits being on a list of evidence-based strategies, and they consider emerging research to take programs off the registry. If new research comes out that questions the original evidence base, they take the program off the registry. So check this out. I think there is a purpose for evidence-based strategies, but it's not the dogmatic way that Australia is currently addressing this. This registry in Australia, in my expert opinion, the standard for the evidence is way too low, and that undermines the very reason for doing it. And this whole idea of a dogmatic approach of just picking some arbitrary percentage number out of the air and saying you have to spend this much of your money on things from this list. There's no rational explanation for that. How did you come up with that number? And how do communities know what they need to know that they need something off this list? Even if this list had good, rigorous standards, which I don't think it does. So, a tool is only as good as its application. You walk into the chemist, everything on the shelves at the chemist is evidence-based. That doesn't mean you can just walk in anytime you're feeling ill, you just walk into the chemist and grab one of these zillion evidence-based things and slather it on or take the pill or whatever, and you're going to feel better. And that's kind of our current approach. If it's evidence-based, it means it's good for everybody in every situation. That's not the case. Before we go to the chemist, we figure out what is the underlying mechanism of our illness, and we match the evidence-based medicine to our illness if there is a good match, right? I don't want to beat this to death. Robitussin is a perfect example, right? How many people have found themselves in the cough medicine aisle, and you're like, I just want to stop coughing. I just want to stop coughing. Why do I have to pick between the 5 colors, right? But, the 5 colors are, theoretically, the 5 colors are addressing different causative mechanisms of the cough. Is it phlegm? Is it a head cold? Is it allergies? Well, you have to know what's driving your cough to know which of the cough medicines is going to be appropriate. There are multiple evidence-based youth drug prevention programs that target different mechanisms that lead to youth drug use. Right? So if you have this diagnostic data profile, this diagnostic risk profile in your community, you can make a community can make more informed decisions, more well-informed decisions, critical decisions about what's going to be the right Robitussin for us. So this is just to get to wrapping things up. This is the formula then. I would say that if I took what we did in Pennsylvania that demonstrated population level improvements, significant statistically and practically improvement on key indicators of child well-being. And I tried to unpack what were the important aspects of that led to that aren't always reflected in business as usual in collective impact initiatives. I would say it is community mobilization with technical assistance. We have short-shrifted the whole idea of community mobilization, of collective impact. We act like this is so easy. We tell communities to coordinate, create a symphony. That's hard stuff. I'll assume that most of you live in a neighborhood, on a street with lots of neighbors. What if I said to you, I will buy everybody in your neighborhood dinner and a movie if you can go home after work tonight and in 2 hours bring all those people together and get them all to agree on what restaurant they're going to and what movie they're going to see? I think my money's safe. That's hard. That's hard negotiation. And think about how that's, jokingly I made that, but think about how hard it is to do the very thing that we're trying to do here. Part of the work that we're doing at Griffith University is creating a new profession called collective impact facilitators that recognizes how difficult this is and what skill set is required. I mean, this should be a recognized profession with specific professional training, workforce development that produces people with the necessary skills to do this kind of work. Systems coordination, we have to reimagine our silos. Data-informed surveillance and diagnosis. Do we even have that capacity? Can we do better at that piece of it? That's a place to start. Evidence-based strategies carefully chosen and applied with fidelity and sustain. So that becomes the formula. So, we need infrastructure support across all of these things. These are new ways of doing business. If we want to do communities for children and have it make a difference, we need to step back and critically reassess what capacities don't currently exist in the infrastructure of C4C that we could build up those capacities instead of, and I hope you're not mad at me. I hope I don't get run out of the room for this. Instead of investing more and more and more money to do the same things that we've been doing and expect them to turn out differently, I would say that it's a better investment to take some of those resources and invest them in this kind of capacity building, these specific kinds of capacity building that allow us to really do collective impact effectively. Like I said, we're at Griffith University. There's a team of us that are working on this. We're developing a bunch of different tools. I'll just give one quick example. I talked about the youth self-report survey. And as great as that is with all the outcomes that we saw, the problem with that is we know that's an adolescent youth self-report survey. We survey 10, 12, 14, and 16-year-olds. To create this risk profile. We know we should be looking further upstream. We need to be assessing the risk factors of kids in early primary school. The problem with that is they don't have the reading comprehension to do one of these self-report surveys. So at Griffith, we've created a video game called Rumble's Quest. A video game that the kids play, and in the course of playing this brief video game that they really, really love, it's fun. They go on an adventure. They do little challenges. And in the course of playing that game, they're generating data. They're answering questions to their little friend that's accompanying them on the adventure. They're playing games that's telling us about their emotion regulation, their delayed gratification skills. And so through the course of playing this game, we can generate a risk profile on a group of kids and then feed it back to a community for decision making in the way I just described. So I'll just close. If you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. Cheshire Cat, Alice in Wonderland, brilliant, right? If you're doing collective impact, but you haven't done a diagnostic needs assessment that's driving what you're doing, then yeah, any road will get you there. You're making progress because you don't know where you're going. right? It's easy, it's really easy in this space to mistake action for progress because we're all super busy. And it's easy to convince ourselves that because we're busy and all the people around us are super busy, we must be making progress. But all we're doing, I mean, we're taking action. But we don't know if that action is getting us any closer to where it should. Collective impact, the public health approach, and evidence-based programs, they represent innovation. But innovation without capacity, it's like being a cow without opposable thumbs and the phone rings. It's of limited value. So, I've set a really big challenge here. But from working in Australia for 10 years, I know that Australia is famous for two things: painted silos, reimagined silos, and big things. Australia is famous for big things. You guys do big things. So I know you can take this on. I don't know what the new next big thing statue will be to honor your achievements, but I'm sure there will be one soon. Thank you.